You're listening to Energy Futures on The Science Show. I'm Carl Smith.
Geoscience Australia did a rough calculation a few years ago now looking at the contained thermal energy in the Australian crust, and we calculated if you could extract 1% of the thermal energy above 5 kilometres depth and hotter than 150 degrees Celsius, that's equal to about 25,000 times Australia's total primary annual energy use. So we have a huge amount of heat in Australia.
That's Dr. Bridget Ayling. She's a geothermal energy researcher at Geoscience Australia. And I just want to reiterate what she said there, because it's staggering. Just 1% of Australia's geothermal energy would fuel the country for millennia. So how can that heat be harnessed to generate electricity? Well, if it's hot enough, it can turn liquids into gases, which could then spin turbines.
It does depend on how hot your geothermal resource is. So in some systems internationally, in New Zealand and in the US and in Iceland, they can use that steam directly to spin a turbine and then generate some power. In Australia, we're likely not going to use the geothermal fluid directly like that, so we'll still have the geothermal fluid, but we'll actually run that through what we call a binary cycle plant. So we'll actually transfer that geothermal heat to a secondary fluid, which might be like isopentane, so something that's actually going to have a lower boiling point than water, and that fluid will be the one to actually flash to steam and spin a turbine.
Where's this energy come from, this heat energy, initially?
Well, there's two sources. Some of that heat is primordial, so that's heat that the planet, I suppose, had when the Earth accreted, so 4.5 billion years ago when the Earth was made. So we have, it's called primordial heat. The rest of it's actually from decay of some elements in rocks in the crust, in the upper crust. So we've got elements like uranium, potassium and thorium, and these are radioactive and break down through time, and as they do that, they release heat. So we've got low levels of these elements in some rocks. They're not high concentrations, they're not toxic, but they're enough that over millions of years we generate heat in those rocks. And if we've got suitable sediments above them, like coal's a very good insulator, we can actually trap some of that heat and have elevated temperatures at quite shallow depths in the upper crust. It's not distributed equally everywhere. We've got some hotspots, and at the moment those hotspots are really in central Australia there. We've got some very high temperatures, about 250 degrees Celsius at 5 kilometres, which is pretty warm. Also, we have some spots that look quite prospective in some basins, so in Victoria, and the Gippsland Basin, and the Otway Basin, the Perth Basin. They all have high temperatures and may be useful for direct use of geothermal as well, or power generation. There currently is only one geothermal power plant in Australia, the one out at Birdsville in southwest Queensland, and that's using 100 degrees Celsius water from the Great Artesian Basin and aquifer there, and generating approximately 80 kilowatts at the moment. So it's a very small plant, but in the future there may be options to generate more from those hot water resources, as well as looking at the hotter and deeper systems, which we call the engineered geothermal systems in Australia, because we haven't got a lot of active volcanism, and so we haven't got the conventional convective systems here. They're mostly going to be the unconventional systems, which require that we do some extra work to access that heat. So we have to drill quite deep, we have to maybe introduce a fluid into those hot rocks at depth, and then circulate that to surface for the power generation. So currently, we haven't got any hot, deep geothermal power generation happening, but we did have one project actually achieve proof of concept with those kind of systems previously. So last year in the central Cooper Basin, they generated 1 megawatt from a pilot project there, which was circulating fluid down to 4 kilometres depth into some hot rock, and that's a massive achievement because it's very challenging to do that. So we have had some wins, but there's more potential for the future.
So geothermal energy could be used to generate lots of electricity. But interestingly, others are finding ways to harness that heat locally, at a much smaller scale. Ian. Yeah, good. That's Ian Hendry. He's a former neuroscientist turned winemaker.
We're at Affleck Vineyard, which is in Bywong, which is near the old gold mining town of Bywong.
He's developed a system that uses geothermal energy to ferment and chill his wine. And he's just using the raw heat of the earth to do that.
The philosophy's really started with the concept of making white wines. basically you're wasting a lot of energy cooling one and then warming it up again. And it occurred to me that if we could actually use a heat pump and pump the heat from one source to the other, you could be cooling one tank while you're warming another tank. That was the sort of logical start of the whole exercise.
Ian Hendry sunk pipes 2.5 metres down under the grapevines. Refrigerant in the pipes is then cooled before being circulated to the house. Below the surface, what's the temperature here?
It's about 18 degrees where the pipes are under the ground, and so the liquid when it comes in sort of will always reach about 18 degrees.
All right, so let's just travel with the refrigerant. It's got to 18 degrees, either cooled or warmed, and we're going to take it through to the house. So let's walk over to the house.
Well, today it's going to be 30 degrees. What would be happening is that the refrigerant would be coming back up from the ground, would be cooled compared to the house. So instead of, on a day like today when you're trying to run normal air conditioning, you're trying to pump heat out into 30 degrees, you're actually pumping heat out into 18 degrees, so it's very, very much more efficient.
I gotcha. So it's basically a traditional air conditioner system, and you've got...
Except the heat sink is very much more efficient than a normal air conditioning system, but it's essentially exactly the same principles as reverse cycle air conditioning.
And as the pipes pick up heat from the house, that's sent over to the wine shed to ferment the reds. After that, the refrigerant loses heat and goes on to chill the whites. So it's all coming just from the ground and from this little patch of dirt that you've got just outside Canberra.
That's exactly right. The whole workings are pretty much self-contained here, yeah.
Now, I want to make it clear that this isn't generating electricity. This approach harnesses geothermal energy purely for its heat. But that does help reduce electricity needs for small sites like Ian Hendry's. And he says others are making the switch.
Certainly in the country, you'd be mad not to set up geothermal. It's so efficient and so useful that it's the best heating system you can get. And people are doing it. It very much is happening.
In fact, back at Geoscience Australia, the whole office building has been heated by geothermal energy for almost 20 years, with electricity savings of over $500,000. Dr. Bridget Ayling says that technology has been around for decades. But while it's handy in some situations, geothermal heat at depth for generating electricity holds much more potential. And unlike many other renewables, there's a constant supply of geothermal energy. It's always available.
Geothermal is base load, which means it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and if it's raining or if it's windy or sunny or dark, it makes no difference to geothermal. So that's really appealing because we can actually rely on it as a base load energy source. And I think that's something that geothermal plants internationally, obviously they're base load, but they have a very high capacity factor, so very low downtime. So I think in terms of plant availability and capacity, they actually maybe have 98% actual operating time, which is very reliable and really good for contributing to the grid.
Fairly recently, the Australian government modelling showed that geothermal was going to be one of the really big ones that would take off. Do you see that happening?
There's a huge potential for geothermal to contribute to Australia's energy mix, but I think fundamentally we have some issues there with the cost of drilling. It's very expensive upfront for geothermal. So explorers are usually quite small companies and they've got to front up a lot of money for drilling, and I think there's some R&D required to reduce the drilling costs so that people can do that more cheaply. Also, the exploration risk in Australia, we still have big data gaps in many places, and that's where we could play a role here at Geoscience Australia to actually help and fill some of those data gaps and try and reduce that exploration risk to try and promote geothermal and help explorers find these hotspots. If you had all the conditions in place there, so I think if we had some more R&D looking at trying to drive down drilling costs between now and then and more data acquisition there to try and get that pre-competitive data to help identify where they might be and support a policy environment, I think it's very likely that geothermal could contribute to Australia's energy mix.